For those of you who think we're going to start, or the SOQ committee, I'm sorry. What we did at the morning meeting went so long that we're going to reorder the presentation a little bit. We're going to do the work session, which was scheduled to start at 2, so that's good. The 12:30 SOQ meeting is going to be held after this 2 o'clock work session, and the SOA meeting will be held following that. So that's where we are publicly. It is my pleasure, I guess, to welcome Jim Wyckoff. Jim has been, a great working partner with this board, has done tremendous academic research on a variety of topics. And, we are all very much appreciative and looking forward to your comments today. At the end of this, we can talk a little bit about SOQs if you want and where we went there. But for now, like I said, we appreciate what you're doing and look forward to your presentation.
Great. Thanks very much. And thanks for making time. I know you guys have a busy day today, and thanks for making time to have a conversation. And I hope it is a conversation. I have a few slides that I want to share with you. They mostly reflect the document that I think you've seen. So I'm going to go by pretty quickly on the slides, but I would strongly encourage you, if you have questions or you want to make points as we go along, that we do that and we don't wait till the end to do that. I'm presenting this on behalf of a couple of my colleagues at the University of Virginia, Veronica Katz and Luke Miller. We have worked together on this to develop the reports. And a third colleague of mine, Dan Clare, who works primarily on the part of this that relates to principles. I'm focusing today on the report that relates to teachers because I think I was advised by staff that might be a good place to begin this conversation. And because I think there's a lot stronger evidence base to support the discussion related to teachers. So I want to start out with data points that I think are, incredibly familiar to you all. I'm referencing the National Assessment of Educational Progress here, and the most recent report out from the Innate Data that shows academic performance in 8th grade math are the results and reading that I'm showing you as just illustrative of some of the disparities that I think you're well familiar with in terms of academic performance in Virginia. And so across racial groups, as you know, there are big differences in terms of the academic performance. What I'm highlighting here are the proportion of students who are below basic on the NAEP exam. And as you probably are aware, below basic means you don't have command over the major concepts that are intended to be taught in 8th grade math or 8th grade reading. So there are 3 categories of achievement above below basic, and there are no categories below basic. So as this graph illustrates, about 40% of the African American 8th graders, both on reading and math, perform in the below basic category. And that's much below the average for Virginia, and it's far below the average for the country. When we isolate the students who also come from families that are disadvantaged, and here disadvantaged means receipt or eligibility to receive free or reduced price lunches, those disparities grow even larger. Nearly half the African American students and a large proportion of the Latino students are below basic on this exam. So there is a lot of work, as you all are well aware, to do in helping both close the achievement gap, but probably at least as importantly, helping these students get to a place where they're going to be successful later in their lives. So I wanted to touch on 4 issues, but again, I'm happy to have this conversation go wherever you would like it to go. And I want to talk about why we should care about teacher evaluation as a data point relative to what I just showed you. Why we should care about teacher evaluation as a mechanism by which we can improve the performance of all the students in Virginia, but particularly students who come from disadvantaged backgrounds. And I want to walk you through how I think that can happen. Then I want to spend a little bit of time, and this is much of what the report that we shared with you focuses on, so happy to skip by that pretty quickly if all that made sense, but I want to share a little bit about what other states and school districts are doing with respect to teacher evaluation. And then I want us to spend some time at the end, if you're willing, talking about where Virginia is in terms of teacher evaluation. So that's my proposed agenda. Happy to have you make whatever changes to that as you like. Here are some quotes. I won't read them to you, but here are several quotes from some of the best academic researchers that examine issues of teacher quality. And all of these document the incredible importance that teachers can make in the lives of kids. This is really just research that I think supports the intuition that we all have, that when we think about how schools can influence outcomes for kids, the primary mechanism through which that's going to occur is through teachers. And this is research that documents how meaningful that can be. I'll just focus on one of these, but if we look at the distribution of teacher effectiveness and we compare a teacher who is in the top quartile to one who's in the bottom quartile, and you had one of those top quartile teachers 4 years in a row relative to a bottom quartile teacher 4 years in a row, that difference in their ability to improve achievement is enough to close the black-white achievement gap nationally. So that's one way of describing the importance that teachers can make to the academic achievement of students. All the rest of the quotes cite similar statistics that are consistent with that. I don't want us to spend a lot of time on this, but we included this in our report as a way of thinking about how teacher evaluation can influence outcomes for kids. So ultimately, I think we're all interested in what we might call later life outcomes for kids. We care about test scores or other outcomes in school because we think they are important markers of what kids will do later in their lives. There are ways of signaling what occurs there. And in this diagram, we've highlighted the ways in which teacher evaluation can influence student outcomes and later life outcomes. But we recognize that there are lots of other things that determine how kids are going to perform in school and how they'll perform later in life. The kids themselves and their families are really important in this regard. Other aspects of the community are really important. There are lots of other organizations beyond schools that make a big difference in kids' lives. So I don't want to give you the impression that we're thinking that schools can do this job on their own, but we do think, given the quotes we just saw, that schools can make a really important difference in kids' lives. And I want to highlight a couple aspects of teacher evaluation because these are the design elements of various teacher evaluation plans that we'll talk in more detail about. But we want to be interested in what are the ways we're going to measure whether teachers are doing a good job? What are the components that we want to measure that would indicate to us whether a teacher is doing a good job? What are we going to do with those measures? So lots of teacher evaluation plans do not provide feedback to teachers. So if you just evaluate a teacher and say, here's your scores, that's not terribly helpful. I mean, that's useful. I know I'm maybe not doing as well as I should be doing, but that doesn't signal to me in a direct way how to get better. So I want to talk a little bit about feedback. One of those feedback mechanisms would also include coaching. And there is increasing evidence that coaching can be a really effective way of helping teachers get better. And then I want to touch on the notion of stakes. Should this have some accountability? Should there be some consequences for teachers or schools based on their performance? And various states and school districts take a different perspective on that. So what I'm about to do is dive into some of the more detailed aspects of these components. And I want to talk a little bit about, what we mean by implementation, because it turns out with respect to teacher evaluation, the implementation is a crucial element. And then we'll talk more about these. But before I dive in, anybody have questions or comments? Does this make rough sense about where we're headed?
Just a question about terminology.
Sure.
And maybe you'll get to a teacher compositional change. What are you referring to there?
Yeah, I will get to that in more
Okay.
detail, but it's the notion that we evaluate a teacher who is doing really well, one of those top quartile teachers. There was a report done about a decade ago, and I think a lot of it still remains fairly true. Many teachers will tell you that teachers who are doing a great job aren't recognized for having done a great job. They're not told, you're doing a great job. We want you to continue to do more. Or in a more structured way, they aren't given some step on a career ladder that recognizes their ability as a teacher that might make use of them as a mentor, for example. So compositional change would be saying, if we've had a lot of discussion in this state over the last few years about teacher retention. If we're thinking about teacher retention, we want to make sure we keep those top quartile teachers. And the ways that we might think about doing that could be just recognition, professional opportunities for those teachers. It could also be compensation. Some states have taken that perspective. We're going to compensate these people who've demonstrated their ability to do really well. On the other end of the distribution, you might be calling out people who are not doing as well, and not in a summative, we're going to fire you way, although some places have done that, but more in a formative, how can we help you get better way? And so it may be that if you came to me and said, you know, Whitecup, you're not doing a great job here, and we need you to get better over the next couple of years, or we're going to have a conversation about maybe counseling you out, or however that conversation would go. And I might say, you know what, I am working about as hard as I can do. If this isn't working out, maybe I should go look for a different career, because not everybody is cut out to be a teacher. So compositional change is saying, it's one version of this, the cliche would be, do we have the right people on the bus? And we want to make sure we're keeping the people who we want. And then the teacher development is saying, once we have those people that we think are good, how can we help them get better? And that means even the people who are doing a relatively weak job right now, can we help them get better so they are at least effective? Maybe they're not the stars, but they're doing a good job. So that's the compositional change.
Thank you.
Yeah, please.
Oh, sure.
Could compositional change also refer to the where are we allocating our teachers? So once we have decent evaluation systems, what does the evidence show about whether we're having our most effective teachers teaching our neediest students,
Yes.
or the reverse?
That's right.
And what do we, once we have, I mean, obviously we don't have a statewide allocation system, but are there ways that our statewide systems can influence allocation such that effective teachers are getting to the kids who need them the most?
That's a great question, and it gets back to the ESSA requirement around the distribution of effective teachers. And so within school divisions, that's a question that we might want to ask school superintendents. Are we allocating the teachers where they need to be? And the research would show that all too often, it is the weaker teachers who end up in schools where the kids need them the most.
And even across divisions, are there state policies, resource allocation, et cetera, that affects distribution of teachers, effective teachers across divisions in such a way that has a negative impact on them?
Exactly right. So the distribution is an important question. So here's more Innate data that I'm throwing at you. These are Innate data. Innate has a group of what are called trial urban districts, and these are school districts that where the Innate becomes then representative of the performance of the students. And here are from the most recent 8th grade math again, performance. And you see, for example, Detroit. 73% of the 8th grade math students in Detroit are below basic. That just astounds me. DC is not good. Although I will tell you, 10 years ago, DC was at 66%. They've improved a great deal. They are not in a great place yet, but they've made great strides. If you look back 10 years, Detroit was about the same spot. So it begs the question, well, how are teachers evaluated in Detroit? 97% of the teachers in Detroit are being told, you're doing a good or a great job. Thank you very much. Now, it's possible that those two things are an accurate assessment of both the performance of the students and the effectiveness of the teachers. But it certainly raises some questions, doesn't it, about whether we're accurately assessing the performance of the teachers when our students are doing so poorly and our teachers are being told, you don't really need to do much else because you're effective or much better than that. Only 4% are being told that they need to get better. So it's those kinds of juxtapositions of data that I think raise questions about how are we doing teacher evaluation. We might raise questions about how we're doing student assessment, the NAEP is regarded as sort of the gold standard. It is the nation's report card. So few people, other than saying, well, maybe we want to look at other outcomes than student achievement tests, which I think is a fair question. But if you're going to look at an achievement test, I think the NAEP is widely regarded as being both valid and reliable measure. So,
Question.
sure.
Given that Detroit example you just articulated, like going back to your theory of change, sort of what factors are sort of at play in affecting student achievement, I'm just curious, as you thought about the Detroit situation, how you also sort of look at and think about contextual factors that are at play in a community like Detroit.
Yeah.
What are they spending? You know, I definitely feel like there's some questions that get raised there with that contrast, but I'm also wanting to appreciate how that element of, how that part of the analysis drives sort of conclusions that might be made.
Yeah, I think I'm certainly unwilling to make any conclusions about the quality of teaching in Detroit just based on this. But I do think, as you suggested, it raises some questions about the quality of teaching. To your point, Detroit is an enormously challenging place to educate kids for all sorts of reasons. Resources, the white flight that has occurred, the lack of economic vibrancy in Detroit. I mean, I think there's lots of reasons why it would be hard, it is hard to educate kids in Detroit. Not obvious to me that Detroit is so different from many other places, and the fact that there's not been much improvement in Detroit over, which I haven't shown you, over a period of time, again, raises some questions. And so I don't know what the right number is in terms of teacher evaluations, but it strikes me that 97% of the teachers, I would like to know more.
Yes, I get it.
Yep.
Can you use the mic?
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry.
You're in teacher mode.
Yeah.
Well, that's right. I wasn't teacher.
And the board members too.
Okay. So if we're thinking about the characteristics of effective teacher evaluation systems, as we looked around the country, across the number of districts that we highlighted in the report, as well as some states, there were 4 elements that we tried to address. Teacher evaluation is a hard thing to do, and the places that seem to be doing it well are places that are using multiple measures of teacher effectiveness. Any one thing is going to give you a slice into a teacher's effectiveness, and you want several of those slices. And we'll talk more about what those slices look like, what are the things we might want to measure. But in the end, you want multiple valid and reliable measures. You also want those measures to be able to differentiate among teachers, distinguish people who are really good from people who are less effective. And the systems that we looked at that seemed to be doing a good job were ones that provided formative feedback and support for teachers. You want this to feel like a system that is supporting teachers, not one that's only judging them. That said, teachers, I think, I have an annual evaluation at the Curry School every year, and I value that evaluation because it helps me understand where I could be making improvements, right? And I think most teachers would value the opportunity to have a rigorous assessment that said, here are your strengths, and we want to find ways of making use of those strengths. Here are some weaknesses. Let's figure out how we can help you get better on those. So the intent here, I think, in places that are doing this well, is that it feels like a formative, supportive environment, but one that nonetheless is calling out in an honest way the weaknesses that seem to appear. Then there is this issue of summative consequences, and we can come back to that. Yes?
So my question really is for me to sort of put it in context. So you say effective teacher evaluation and ones that are doing it well. How are you judging that they are doing it well? Is it based on the student outcomes? Is it based on teachers' appreciation of what's happening with them in that evaluation process? I want to get a better understanding of sort of globally what you have used to determine the effectiveness of the various programs.
That is a great question, and there is some limited research that assesses what states and districts have done in this regard. I've worked with a group of folks at the Curry School and the DC Public Schools for the last 8 years. As you probably know, DC has a controversial teacher evaluation system. And we've gotten data from them. We've tried to assess whether that evaluation system is helping teachers get better and whether it could be improved. And so a lot of the conclusions that we are arriving at are from examining what's been happening in places like Tennessee, DC, and a few other places where they seem to have implemented this in a way that's consistent with some of these principles. This is far from research where I'd say we know exactly what to recommend. This is still a work in progress.
Thank you.
Yeah. So ultimately what we want to do is figure out, we want to figure out how we could help kids get better, whether it's achievement or other outcome measures. So what are the ways in which teachers could help kids get better? So one of those ways is we could look at assessments of student performance. Sometimes this is a statistical methodology called value added. Virginia used student growth profiles. I mean, there are other ways of evaluating, but it is notion of, in order to assess whether teachers are helping kids get better, let's look at whether kids are getting better. And there are multiple ways of doing that. So this is one of those slices into seeing whether kids are improving. It has its strengths and it has its weaknesses, and happy to talk more about any of those, but there are some things that are good about those student achievement growth measures, and there are some things that like teaching to the test and other things that we've heard about. What's common to almost every teacher evaluation system is some observation of teachers' performance. So a trained observer goes to a classroom, observes a teacher, evaluates that teacher, hopefully based on some rubric of standards that are defined as elements of effective teaching, and assesses those teacher across those subdomains of effective teaching. That then becomes an evaluation that can be used with the teacher to help the teacher improve on the areas of weaknesses. Many places are moving to the use of student surveys, and not the kind that I'm subjected to every year, where it basically says, Wyckoff was a worthwhile teacher. Totally disagree, totally agree. But more, my teacher came prepared to teach most days. Very specific questions about the performance aspects that students who are there every day can see and accurately assess. My teacher engages me in the topics we discuss. So you can imagine, and there are well-designed student surveys. These are typically given in grades 3 and above as part of some of these components. There are other measures. These aren't the only 3, but this is the kind of, when I say multiple measures, many of the systems, and we'll see in a minute, include these 3 measures or a couple of others. This is too small for you to see, but it's in the report. And this came from a research article that looked across states and districts to see what were the components that those states and districts used when they evaluated teachers. The box at the top is my sort of rough guesstimate. It varies a lot across states and districts, but in many places, the standards-based classroom observations usually are on the order of 1/2 to 2/3 to 3/4 of the weight of the overall evaluation. So most of the weight is placed on those observations. Some version of student achievement is on the order of 15 to 25, sometimes more, but 15 to 30% of the evaluation. And then there are other components that occupy important but smaller shares. So as we look across states, again, there's lots of variability, but this gives you some idea of what states and some of the larger districts that were included in this study are doing. So the question comes down, and I think we're all familiar with teacher observations where a principal will come and sit in the back of the classroom for 10 minutes once or twice during the year, and that is what is labeled an evaluation. That is not what I'm referencing here. Many states require that principals or other trained observers observe class on the order of 30 to 45 minutes multiple times a year. Not every state does that, but what you don't want to do is catch a teacher on a particularly bad day or a class on a particularly bad day and make a judgment about that teacher's performance based on that one relatively short observation. This gets to the question of differentiation. And so what you see here is that across the 24 states that are included in this research article, many have very few teachers who are judged to be below effective. So the two categories that we've highlighted here are a category that's either called developing or needs improvement, and the category that is usually the lowest, which is ineffective or unsatisfactory. And taken together, in most of the states that were assessed here, these are on the order of 3 or 4% of the teachers. Again, that may be right. Maybe most of the maybe 95, 96% of the teachers are doing a pretty good job. I think it does raise some questions. If that's true, then how are we giving teachers feedback about how they get better if everybody is sort of being told, you're doing really great, thanks? Sure.
And are the needs improvement lines, I can't tell whether that's like 22, 23, 24 for like Florida, Idaho, North Carolina, or 2.2, 2.3.
Oh, it's 2.2, 2.3. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
So-
that's okay, that's all I need.
Yeah.
There's a decimal point there.
So this is,
In other words, in both of those categories, the numbers are really low most everywhere.
yeah, most everywhere, less than 5% of the teachers are being told they're less than effective in a 4-category rating system. A few are not. And there's more differentiation here. I mean, New Mexico is sort of off the charts in terms of what percentage of teachers are being told they're not doing a great job. So this is just, how states have been using some version of student learning in their evaluation systems. It sort of peaked at about 43, and it's declined a little bit in the last few years. My take on this is a result of the pushback around standardized testing and the pushback around using standardized testing as a metric. And so some states are backing away from this. I'm not going to drag you through all these tables. These are in your report. They are the places that the states and districts that we did a much deeper dive on. The research I presented up to this point is research that's been published in the academic literature, which we reviewed and summarized. This is research that we did as part of the report we wrote for you, and it summarizes a few places that we found interesting in a variety of ways. I am happy to answer any questions or talk about any aspects of that, but there's a lot there, and maybe it's not the best use of our time for us to have me drag you through those. But if anybody has comments or questions about any of that, happy to talk about it.
I don't recall seeing in the report how you chose the 7 that you've identified
Yeah, it's a good question.
and how they may relate to the conversations perhaps that we're having in Virginia.
Yeah. So we chose these partly because of the availability of information that allowed us to dive deeper. We chose them because we thought they illustrated some important aspects of the attributes of teacher evaluation and allowed us to get a little bit of window in that. So it was a selected sample based on the data that we could get, but also based on the things that we thought were illustrative of some of the principles.
Thank you.
So again, I'm just gonna flip through these unless you wanna stop.
One quick question. When you gathered the data on the states you selected, was there any information included on sort of the costs, both time-wise, associated with implementing these approaches to a teacher assessment?
No, there was not, but that is a wonderful question. Doing teacher evaluation well is not cheap. I mean, and this gets to the implementation question that I referenced earlier. If you're going to do this well, you can imagine, so for example, several places, I said trained observers. What that means in the places that I think are doing these well are that you and I go, there's a video of a teacher teaching a class. You and I watch that video. You evaluate it using the rubric that we've agreed to use. I evaluate it. And then we compare that to what an expert would say. And if we're not really close to what that expert would say, we got to practice some more, because we want these to be aligned to what an expert who understands effective teaching would rate that teacher on this same rubric. And so that training takes time for principals if they're the ones doing the evaluation, or for others. And people, the places that are doing this well, that alignment occurs annually. I have to demonstrate that I can evaluate a teacher in a rigorous way, not exactly the same, because two people might see it a little differently. But if this is a 1-to-4 scale on 9 different elements, it shouldn't be the case that you're saying this teacher's super on this dimension and I'm saying, no, I think she's really bad. That discrepancy somehow needs to get narrowed. So that's one aspect of this that makes this expensive to do, both in terms of time and in terms of other resources that we might need in order for that to occur. The other part of this that becomes expensive is the feedback and coaching. As you know, coaching is not cheap, but if we take this seriously, we want teachers to be getting feedback on their weaknesses in a way that helps them get better. So I do know DC, which is not a big district by 40,000 students, DC spends about $13 million a year on teacher evaluation, just on the evaluation. And that involves many things, but that's the only data point that I have on cost. So we assessed implementation in these places that we looked at, and this is a judgment on our part based on what we observed there. And you see some of these places are doing a pretty decent job on implementation. Other places seem to be doing a weak job on various aspects of implementation. So I want to transition to a conversation about what we're doing about teacher evaluation in Virginia. And as a way of making that transition, I'm showing you data that you know better than I do, I think. These are 8th grade math and reading pass rates on the 1819 SOL exam. And as you know, there are places in Virginia whose students really struggle with the SOL. And I think this gets back to the point that was made earlier about differentiation. So I'd like to know, how are we evaluating teachers in these places? Not just in Petersburg and Richmond and Norfolk, but in all the school divisions in Virginia. I mean, you all and the department have requirements around teacher evaluation. And I think, again, it gets back to this question. It may be they're all being done exactly the way they should be doing. But if we think that teacher evaluation is an entree point to helping teachers improve if we think that Virginia is like almost every other place for which we've seen data on teacher performance, that there are some teachers that are doing a super job, there are some teachers that are doing a very weak job, and there are lots of teachers in the middle doing a pretty good job, then shouldn't we want to know what those strengths and weaknesses are so we can help those teachers that aren't doing so well get better, and leverage the talents of the ones that are doing really well and send them the signal you're doing really well. So again, I'm preaching to the choir on this one, but you know, the SOQs have a standard around this, and you know, as I read the Uniform Performance Standards and Evaluation for teachers, you know, it talks about ways that are suggested for school divisions to be implementing the standard of quality. I guess what I'm unsure of is what's actually happening in school divisions. And that's the conversation I was hoping we could have. First of all, to get your feedback about whether you think this is worth trying to understand in a deeper way. And second of all, how we go about, if so, how we go about doing that. So I'm going to step out of my lecture mode and hopefully end up in a conversation with you all about what this might look like, or what this does look like in Virginia, and how we might think about ways that we can use that information to address the questions of student performance, the distribution of student performance, and the distribution of effective teaching in Virginia. So I don't think we know in this room, Patty might correct me, to my knowledge, we don't know the answer to this question at the state level. Maybe that's wrong.
We've been looking at, so I'll confess I haven't read the report, I'm eager to.
That's fine.
But we've been looking at the teacher experience data
Mm-hmm.
and some other indicators that might be proxies for effectiveness. And what we're finding is that, not surprisingly, using teacher experience as a proxy for effectiveness, that the distribution is uneven, but that it mirrors economics more than we would want.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And in that regard, Virginia looks like a lot of other places in terms of experience. I will say that in the places where we have measures of teacher effectiveness, experience is positively correlated with more effective teaching, but it is far from a perfect correlation. It's a relatively weak correlation. For example, correlating experience with the scores that teachers receive on these observation rubrics. So it's a useful data point, and in the absence of other things, you certainly want that to account. And yes, I totally agree. If disadvantaged kids are only getting access to relatively inexperienced teachers, that is a problem.
And I guess the other thing we've used as a proxy a little bit is, I think we've looked some at licensure status, so provisional licensees versus full licensees. That, again, a very weak proxy, but
Yeah.
And also we've looked at the vacancies, which is a little bit different, but
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. All those things are correlated with, but probably different from and not as nuanced. I mean, none of those things would help us understand how to guide the improvement of teachers, right? Can't tell somebody to get more experienced other than, stay on the job. So I think one of the advantages of having a evaluation system is around the improvement part of this. And that's the piece of it that I think is, for me, 98% of the effort. I mean, yes, the compositional change is important. There are some people who just shouldn't be teaching in the classrooms in this state and in other states. But in my view, that's, even in DC, those were the headlines, right? Michelle Rhee fires 300 teachers. DC has fired far less than 2% of its teachers over the last 10 years. So it gets the headlines, but that's a small part of what they're doing. Their efforts are primarily, at this point, focused on helping people get better.
So the one, so not having read your report, forgive me
That's
if
fine.
this is in there, but so the importance of effective teachers, absolutely. Yeah. Do we know whether effective evaluation systems help us get more effective teachers?
Yeah.
you know, obviously to get more effective teachers, we need many things.
Right.
Policy, resources, et cetera, but is it worth the trouble to design an effective evaluation system if you get much bang for your buck? If you do, in terms of teacher quality effectiveness.
Yeah, so limited research on the answer to that question, mixed research on the answer to that question. The third point I make is the places that have not seen strong improvements as a result of teacher evaluations are generally places that have not implemented it well, not provided the resources necessary to implement it well. It just is one other thing that gets added to the principal's to-do list. Now I have to visit every teacher in my school, 25, 30, 40, whatever teachers it is, the principal or the AP, and I still have to do all the other things I had to do before you now told me I had to do that. And oh, by the way, you're telling me I have to do it 2 or 3 times a year for at least a half an hour? I will leave it to you all, but I think most principals would say, I don't know where I'm going to find the time to do that. And so when it gets done, it often doesn't get done well. And so if we require teacher evaluation, I think we should require that it's being done well, or we should just forget about it, because it's not going to make a difference if we don't do it well. We and a couple of other people, so in DC, when I mentioned we've done work there, if you look at, so DC rates teachers into one of 4 categories. The bottom group is fired at the end of the school year, and it's a relatively small number of teachers. The next group is told, if you don't get better within 1 year, you will be fired. If we watch what happens when teachers who are either rated ineffective, the lowest group, or minimally effective, the next lowest group, when they leave, and we just observe what happens in the classrooms the following year, what happens to the student achievement in the classrooms in the following year, just the average teacher who walks into those classrooms, and this is occurring in hundreds and hundreds of classrooms in DC, student learning goes up that next year by 4 months of learning, almost half a year's worth of learning. It is huge. It far outstrips class size reduction, almost all the other policy levers that we have, but again, something specific is going on in DC, and that is they are getting rid of some teachers who are doing a relatively weak job, and they have the ability to replace those teachers with teachers who are going to come in and do, on average, not everyone, but on average, do a relatively good job. Not everybody would fare so well in that regard. DC is a special kind of labor market for teachers. So, for example, I would not suspect that this would work well in Petersburg or in Richmond to say we're going to fire these teachers and then replace them with people who are going to be much better. That may be possible. I'm not convinced right now that the labor market for teachers in Petersburg and Richmond would generate the kind of improvements that I just described. But it might, I don't know. But the point here is they use that evaluation system, and they have made big improvements in the quality of teaching in DC public schools, not without some pushback and dissatisfaction from teachers and the teachers union, for sure. I'm not suggesting this is all a good news story in DC, but in terms of student achievement, I think there's the research we've done and been published in some of the best journals shows that system has improved student achievement. Yeah.
So what's the difference, what do you think is the difference in context between DC, Petersburg, and Richmond? And I'm familiar with the fact that I think DC's evaluation system has been implemented contemporaneously with some not small, but significant boost to teacher pay. So is that, I mean,
that's
words you're saying in DC, when we fire bad people, we've got good people clamoring at the door. Is teacher pay a necessary, that significant boost in teacher pay a necessary condition to the effectiveness of it? Or what? What's the magic that you think makes it work in DC but makes you skeptical it would work in Richmond or Petersburg?
So I think there's a couple of things.
Or better put, what else do we need to do to make it work in Richmond?
Yeah. So I think the compensation issue is a great point, that DC rewards its highly effective teachers very well. You can be making well over $100,000 6 years into your career in DC if you are judged to be highly effective. And there are many teachers who are now in that category. If you're teaching in one of their high poverty schools, you get a $25,000 bonus at the end of the year if you're judged to be highly effective. Big rewards for being effective. But their take is that we want to recognize these people. They are doing a great job for our students. It's worth it to pay those people that for all sorts of reasons. I think the other thing that's occurring in DC, that's a labor market where lots of young people want to be. I think there's lots of young folks that want to be in DC. DC public schools, it's maybe not an advantage on the whole, but about half the kids in DC go to a charter school. There, I believe, I've not been able to get the data to document this, but I believe that a lot of the teachers that DC hires, a third of the teachers that DC hires have prior teaching experience. So the new hires have taught somewhere else. I think they're coming from the charter schools. And it's because the DC public schools pay better than the charter schools. They're able to leverage this inflow of teachers. And I think that's just a different market than might exist in Richmond or Petersburg. I think the compensation's a part of it. The other part of it, I think, is the other issue that you all are concerned about, and that is school leadership. I want to work in a place where I feel like the principal has my back, that he or she is supportive, is helping me get better, is implementing this in a formative way that helps all the teachers in that school get better. If you look at the reasons across almost any state or school district, when you do exit surveys of teachers and ask them why they're leaving, number one issue is school leadership. I don't feel like I had an effective school leader. And this is disproportionately true in schools that serve disproportionate numbers of disadvantaged students, right? It gets back to this problem that you identified earlier. Yeah.
Diane?
In the research that you've done, especially in the DC area, I'm sort of curious, do you have feedback from the teachers themselves as to their acceptance, how valuable they felt the process was for them?
Yeah, it's a good question. And DC is in the midst of, they're 10 years into this system, and they're in the midst of doing a major review of that system. And that is one of the issues that they want to make improvements on. So we have a paper in progress that tries to get at this question. So when we look at DC, virtually requires every teacher who leaves to fill out an exit survey about where they're going, why they're leaving. If you ask them, are you leaving because of the evaluation system? A fair number lists that as one of their top three. But if you look at the effective or highly effective teachers that are leaving, less than 5% of them say it's because of the evaluation system. The people who don't like it are the people who are evaluated poorly. Now, that may be because they are really good teachers and this system mischaracterized them. Or it may be they're not very good teachers and they don't like being called on it because it is the reason that they may be leaving. They may be being forced out. So I don't have a perfect answer to that question, but I think it's a concern. And to me, this gets back how you implement this. If it's treated as, we're here to judge you and you're not doing a great job, you need to figure out how to get better, I think most people wouldn't like that system. I think a lot of people, and I think teachers are like most of us, you tell me that I'm an effective teacher even. I'm saying, okay, how do I become highly effective? I don't want to be effective. I want to be in that other group. But I need the information that helps me get there. And this, to me, is the real value of the feedback they're getting, is it gives them the signals about how to do that in a systematic way. It's not just somebody's opinion. It's somebody's opinion based on the science behind those measures that we talked about.
Of course, yeah.
So in your research in the different states that you were states and districts that you were looking at, for those localities that did in fact tie professional development to that evaluation, did you find a distinction between that and the ones that did not do such a good job with that?
Yeah, that is another great question for which we aren't able to suss that out from the data. And this gets back to the question about what we mean by professional development. So is this kind of an evaluation would suggest that professional development should be targeted and at least small groups or individuals, not whole school professional, because the whole school has quite different needs, the teachers in that school. And so as you know, there's lots of different forms of professional development that occur, and that is data that's not readily available to us. So this just builds on the conversation that we're having. But I think if you be able to answer these questions, and I'm unaware of either the data or the analysis that provides the answers to those questions for Virginia. And my pitch to you today is obviously to say that would be wonderful information to have, to help us all think more about the potential for, there are probably many schools and school divisions in this state that are doing a great job on assessing teachers' performance and providing them feedback. We just don't know. And wouldn't it be wonderful to know that and then provide those as examples to other school divisions about how they could do this work more effectively?
I think that's a great way to phrase that, as we think about what we do in our system statewide, how do we go about finding out which of our divisions, if any, are having a more effective system? What would you do to go about that?
The first thing I would propose is that we just collect the data on what the school divisions are doing. And if we collected that data over time and then looked at, well, here's a school division that says their teachers are getting better. Do we also observe their students are getting better over time? I mean, I think there's just some simple things we could do, but then there's much richer, deeper analysis where you identify those places that you think, based on the data that you've collected, are doing a good job. Well, let's take a deep dive and figure out exactly what they're doing and try to understand whether they're making the kinds of improvements that you all would want them to make. So that's what I had for you all. I'm happy to answer other questions that might occur to you, and I appreciate the opportunity. Yeah.
I just have one more about the DC example, since you did a deep dive there. What % of the evaluation focused on student achievement as a component of the
Yeah, and I'm sorry I don't have slides for you. I didn't anticipate spending so much time on. I'm happy to. I've got plenty of slides on DC that I can share with you. So when it started off for the teachers, so in DC, like most school districts, only 20% of the, less than 20% of the teachers are actually in a tested grade or subject. So standardized student tests only apply to those teachers. So about 18% of the teachers in DC actually got a value-added measure or another version of value-added. Started out for those teachers, it was 50% of their evaluation in the first 3 years. They got pushback from teachers about it. Said, we have no, this is a statistical black box. I have no idea what occurs here. I have no idea how I can make it better. They said, fine, we'll reduce it. They cut it to 35%. And there's discussions ongoing in DC, and I'm certainly not in a position to speak for them, but the question is, can it be reduced more? Can we get the value that we think we get from having a measure like that and have it occupy a smaller share of the overall evaluation? But again, this apply, I mean, 80% of the teachers in DC aren't subject to that measure.
So this is actually a question for Dr. Lane, which I think gets to some of the questions, Dr. Wyckoff, that you've raised. Aside from the items Ms. Holton has held up as semblances of proxies for or effectiveness teacher evaluation, what exactly are we collecting at the state level with regard to teacher evaluation that we bring from districts? Is there any set of common criteria or common data set that we have? And then what are the thoughts about what we might do from the department level?
Yeah, right now we're not collecting any of the teachers' ratings or even information on how they might be implementing the teacher evaluation system. But I will say the code does require that the division's teacher evaluation systems are consistent with your guidelines. And we're going to do a quick review on that tomorrow, which I'm sure you've already read, and make some recommendations for how to make it better. one of the things we'll talk about in more detail tomorrow is what I think is a three-phase move towards where we want to go with teacher evaluation in terms of recommendation from the department. The first is we've worked closely with some of the associations to make a small categorical change around the weighting of the test scores. And I believe that's a huge first step in the right direction towards there being support for us to consider a broader collection of evidence at the state. Then step two, I think what you'll find we're going to recommend is that we bring in a vendor, I can't say which one, to tweak our current system to essentially make sure that it's in alignment with what's going to be in these profiles and is an enhancement of what we did 7-8 years ago, but really not a major overhaul to the system. In order to do so, there's no funding for this. We will have to use Title II funding. And if we use Title II funding, it will require that we collect summative ratings. So that is where we will begin collecting summative ratings. And then the third phase of the work, we really want to look at a multi-year committee-based heavy study on what the ideal teacher evaluation system in Virginia may be. We're going to get to where we have something that everybody's comfortable with and that we can collect summative ratings on, as you had asked, by the end of the year, which will meet my 18-month timeline. And then we'll work on the teacher professional development piece subsequent to that. But this really major overhaul to the teacher evaluation system, I think, is longer off. Now, the reason I mentioned that is at the board, we're having Mr. Wyckoff share, or Dr. Wyckoff share his information with you today. And in his report, there is a heavy emphasis on value add and student outcomes. We're also going to bring in other researchers to talk about some of the other models of teacher evaluation out there. Even at UVA, there is a model being built with a much heavier focus on student and teacher interactions. And so we're going to sort through a lot of these over the next year with you. That was a long answer to say we're moving towards collecting summative ratings, but we want to make sure that there's support from all of the associations around the model that we have before we do so.
Could I follow up?
Yes,
Sorry.
okay.
So at this moment, division superintendents certify that they are implementing or focusing on standard 5 of the SOQ.
Right.
So at this moment, for people who don't understand what our process is at the division level, understanding that while the state may not collect data, divisions do tell us in some form or fashion that they are meeting the tenets of standard 5.
Right. We can say with confidence that everyone is implementing a system consistent with your guidelines.
But what we do not know is the extent to which that consistency, what the extent of that consistency is.
Right.
Okay. There are days when I feel pretty lost, and this may be one of them, so you'll forgive this if this is entirely just off out of left field. But it seems to me that, eventually you need to get to an observation-based system if you're going to accomplish your goal of really using whatever system it is to point out areas of improvement in the teaching profession. Is that right, or is that not right?
I think that's right. And as Dr. Lane suggested, I've colleagues at the Curry School and at UVA who pioneered one of these observation protocols. There are several. But I think almost every state, every district that I'm aware of uses some form of standards-based observation as part of their evaluation system. And it usually occupies a fairly large share for all the reasons that I think you're alluding to, is that becomes the basis by which we can target feedback, by which we could target coaching and other forms of professional development.
And so the second piece of the effective evaluation system here would be to actually have it meaningfully translate into additional professional development work as deficiencies in certain areas, whether it be classroom management, content knowledge, et cetera, are highlighted in the evaluation. So that would be fair, or is
Yes.
that not?
Yes.
But maybe I would add to that, or effective feedback. It may not lead to professional development, but feedback alone can change practice. I think is fair to say.
Yeah, I think we don't know enough about I think for many people, just getting the scores. Oh, I'm doing bad on this. I didn't realize that. So even without anything
enough.
other than
No, I
seeing your
think that's
score,
fair.
that would help. But the feedback, whereby, say, within a week or two of receiving the observation, you had the observer provide you with, you're doing weak on these things, and Miss Smith down the hallway is doing great on those things. Go talk to her about how you could do better. And that's the feedback. But then the coaching is yet again another thing where somebody visits your classroom and gets together with you afterwards to say more specifically about how you could do those things.
Okay, and
Yeah.
once we had, instead of having a pure summative rating system, once we had sort of the various categories of what makes an effective teacher evaluated, we could then much more effectively allocate teachers in a fashion to, as you suggest, I think one of your quotes says, in 4 years, we can eliminate the achievement gap. If you, who knows if that's right or not, but I understand that concept. I've seen that study. But right now we're forced to use for equitable distribution, whether under ESSA or whether under the proposed SOQs, that proxy that we've talked about, experience. But with a little bit more data, we could do a lot better. And in addition, I've certainly seen the work that says if you, because of the adverse impact and long-lasting adverse impact of a poor teacher on a child's educational path, eliminating, if you will, the lower performing, as you suggested, the DC system does. That is, not a lot of them, but pick a small percentage and say there are some people who we don't believe the more years of experience will help enough to overcome the harm you're going to do to a generation of kids if we leave you here, right? So the observation-based system could accommodate that issue also, right?
I think it could, and many principals now counsel out what they judge to be ineffective teachers. This provides a more rigorous way of figuring out, and you're not leaving it to the total discretion that one principal might see it one way and another principal sees it another way. It becomes much more systematic about trying to identify those very weakest performers.
It's an interesting comment, and I'll tell you just again, my life experience is slightly contrary to that. I remember after the 2008 recession, and we, in Chesterfield, when I was on the board there were a certain number of teaching positions that were eliminated as part of the recession planning. And there had been a significant suggestion that we not offer renewal to those teachers who the principals understood to be the, least effective. And instead what occurred was it was entirely sort of seniority based at that point. And I guess I drew from that maybe an incorrect conclusion that throughout the profession there might be a reluctance to, actually eliminate positions for the lower performing teachers in favor of other measures that the principal might have.
My take would be that that's unevenly decided on, that
Okay.
there are principals who want the students in their school. Well, I think all the principals want their students in the school to be getting the best education.
Sure.
But there are principals who will use their opportunities to counsel out teachers before a tenure decision, for example, to use that as an opportunity to say, this may not be the right career for you. Here's why. I think there's obviously, that becomes a hard conversation, right? And not all principals are willing to equally engage in that conversation, I guess. And for me, having a system like the one we've talked about creates the sort of more even playing field across principals.
Okay, I mean, this also suggests that teachers can be taught to teach instead of just everybody who's a teacher is naturally gifted at it, which is one of those things that we lay people hear all the time, is that either you're a teacher or you're not. But there are clearly certain aspects of the profession that can be taught and improved upon.
Yes, I think that's, I'm sorry.
No,
I think that's absolutely true. And we've got a lot of evidence that
exactly
teachers can get better at what they do. They need, however, the information to know how to do that.
Okay, so how far are we? I know, James has talked about, surveying Virginia, and, every time I hear words like that, with all due respect, I hear time, a lot of time to get to where we want to be. But it seems like there's been significant amount of work done in other places on this topic. How much of that work can be used to define a system here that might be more effective in terms of evaluation than, I wouldn't say scattershot, but the very limited supervised system we have today?
I think there's a lot of information, and I think, potentially hearing from people where, I think people in Tennessee have been thoughtful about this, for example.
Okay.
I think there are places where you would get some insights from the people who've actually designed and implemented those systems in some other states that could speak to that. So I think there's a lot that you could learn based on what's already occurred over the last 10 years in some other places.
Yeah, and just let me make one other comment, and then I'll be quiet about all of this. I mean, I will say, Jim, that the work that you guys did for us with regard to sort of the compilation of literature, that y'all provided us to guide the work of our SOQ committee. I mean, I think what you're saying here is exactly what was said there, which is teachers matter. And I think that the draft of the SOQs that will be before the board tomorrow is really a reflection of, that work. That is, that teachers matter, and that we need to provide alternative career paths for teachers. That is not just up into administration. We need to provide that early mentoring and support, and we need to provide continuous professional development. And then finally, we need to get the right teachers in front of the kids who need them the most. And so, I am truly thankful for that, and I'm happy to see that this work clearly dovetails well into the other piece of work y'all have done with us, and creates a very cogent, coherent system. Something that I think people will understand and places the focus in the appropriate place.
Let me say one other thing. Goes back to a point that Dr. Lane made a minute ago. I don't think there's one right way to do teacher evaluation. I think it can be done in lots of ways, but I think there's some core principles that need to be included. And so I think you can make different teacher evaluation systems, and different districts and different divisions can do it differently. But I think in the end, they have to have some of the principles that we've discussed, that it's done rigorously, that it is seen as a formative opportunity, that it is around the development. So I think those principles can get implemented with different kinds of observations, more weights on some things, less weights on others. I don't think there's any magic there, but I think those principles need to be attended to.
Yeah, and when I talk about the time that it will take, part of that is because I believe that to do this right, we have to get buy-in on the front end and not on the back end. And that's, where I think that if we can signal over the next year that we're willing to align professional development to something that teachers will think is effective and not punitive, which they've made those comments to me. But then we start a process where we, identify a system in a very thoughtful way that Virginia is supportive of. Then I think that we also have time to actually train people on this, because the moment that we decide on it is not the moment that it will be implemented. If we put in a new system, we're effectively retraining every principal in the state, but we're also retraining every school board in the state, because we often align these systems to superintendent evaluation, and that's where the time comes in. But then the other piece of it is that's going to take time is developing the support to get the funding necessary to pull this off, because Title II will be able to fund the revision, but it won't be able to fund the retraining of all these folks. And in Tennessee, you heard what DC, $13 million for 40,000 students, but in Tennessee, they did put in statewide growth measures and other facets that built out their system that we don't have nearly the funding for to be able to pull off. And so I think that time again is not about our willingness to bring the project to fruition. It's the reality of what it will take to get everyone on board, from the associations to the board and to the General Assembly, to be able to be where we want to be.
Anybody else?
Thank you very much for your interest and time.
Thank you so much.
Ready?
Yeah.
All right.
We're ready.
Good afternoon. I'm pleased to present to you today and discuss the board's annual report on the condition and needs of public schools in Virginia. As you will note in your Thursday boilerplate, the report is required by the Code of Virginia. I will mention that some of the reports outlined in the appendices are still being finalized, so you do not see them in your current draft, but they will be included in the November board item. This draft of the annual report presents the needs of public education in Virginia, an update on the board's work over the past year, and a summary of achievement of students in schools. Items highlighted in yellow still need to be updated as some data is not yet available. Otherwise, the data points have been updated with the most recent year's data. Since adopting your comprehensive plan in November of 2017, you have dedicated your time and focus on these three priorities. Over the past year, much of your work has been focused on revisions to the standards of quality. The update includes a brief summary of the proposed SOQ revisions within each priority area, along with the data and research to support that revision. Following your decision on the SOQ revisions, the full SOQ will be included as an appendix in the report along with a letter from the board. The remainder of the report, which includes a summary of the achievement, outlines the accolades for Virginia, updates to the accreditation status, and suspension and expulsion rates among demographic groups. An executive summary will be completed following the revisions from this work session and first review. And so with that, in the essence of keeping it very brief, I will open it to the floor for any comments, edits, or questions you have about the annual report.
Okay. Are there any comments, edits, questions? I think you've caught him at a good moment.
I have some little edits I don't need to go through. I'll hand them to
That's
her.
fine.
'Cause-
Sure.
But I do have one question.
Absolutely.
On page, I think it's 14 and 15, you're talking about salaries. And you start with, it's the last paragraph on page 14 leading into it leads over into page 15.
Yes.
You start with looking at teachers in 0809 and their base salary of $40,000. And then you start to talk about current salaries, and it's 40. What would be helpful, I think, to really highlight where the discrepancy is there is to account for inflation so that people would understand that a $40,000 salary in 0809 should be this currently, because
Gotcha.
otherwise that doesn't really jump
Translate
out
well.
at you.
Absolutely. Can do that.
Go ahead.
You go ahead.
You go ahead, because I'm not exactly
Okay,
going to find it.
so I likewise will hand you a draft with just scribblings for what they're worth. And I understand you are going to add an executive summary that's got more content.
Yeah, I wanted to make sure we had a better final draft before I drafted the
Yeah.
executive summary,
Good.
similar to what I
Good.
did last year. I don't want to have the exact same points, but that will be drafted. It'll be a 1 or 2 pager.
I would love to see, so I've got 2 things, and one is the executive summary. I'd love to have it say in a clear and concise way that we are making major revisions to the SOQs, number 1, and number 2, to have some summary of what's been our, I think the big highlights this year is SOQ changes and what's been the implementation of the SOA changes.
Okay.
What are the implications of the SOA changes so far? And so those are the 2 things I would love to see you highlight in the executive summary. I'm looking at page 12, the teacher vacancies, and seeing that we're actually seeing a decline now over 2 years. And, we have seen some presentations along the way that I remember ECS in particular, Education Commission on the States, their take on the teacher shortage top line numbers was, it's all a little cyclical, don't everybody panic.
Do you mind?
Sure.
This one is interesting in that when we get deep into this data, There are essentially some medium to large size school divisions that put new leadership in place that were historically not filling vacancies, that are significantly filling their vacancies now on time. So, so the shortage in part, at least in those divisions, can be attributed to administration. And in this case, the decline is not necessarily around any more injection into the pipeline, but really is about good administration.
So I hear you, but that doesn't, the data does not tell the story well. I mean, to me, this data could be consistent with a cyclical ebb and flow. And so I don't know whether we yet have a 1920 data point or when we will, and whether we'll have that in time to include. No. Or is there other data that helps tell the story better? Or, I mean, I think the ECS folks raised a general question. I mean, clearly we are facing teacher shortages overall, but how intense they are overall versus in specific geographic areas / subject matter areas, I think it, sort of remains an open question a little bit. And I just say that, where you claim teacher vacancies, teacher shortages are bad and getting worse, but the chart looks like up and then down. If you had one down data point, you could explain it away. But when you got two down data points, the chart, and there may be other indicators that we could use that would tell a clearer story, or maybe we need to do the more in-depth explanation that James has added. But that kind of sounds like, in other words, that's sort of an explanation of why the data doesn't support our argument rather than an evidence of what does support our argument. So, maybe even skip this data altogether and go to the data about the declining interest in the teaching profession expressed in the SAT survey, or is it the ACT survey?
I think it's ACT survey.
And has that continued to decline, or has that turned around? Or the declining enrollments in teacher prep programs, or has that turned around? So maybe there's some other indicators we can use that tell the story better, or maybe we're wrong on the story.
Well, I think that, my opinion only, I think the data is important. And the way that I often talk about this is, whereas we peaked with the number of vacancies in 2017 due to some improved administrative practices, we've seen a slight decline, but they're still far too high, which I think is the point that you want to make.
I do still think there's, significant vacancies, but
Right.
I do understand your point. So maybe we could add some additional data points.
Yeah, and actually,
this.
another way to do it might just to make the chart longer, right? So if you see, over 15 years that they've been hovering around 400, and then now they're up well over 800 for 4 years in a row, that might look different, right? Right now, it looks like up and then back down.
We can see what we
But
got.
if it's long, steady at 400, and then consistently for 4 years now above 800, more than double. So again, I'm just trying to make them, help the message jump out.
No problem.
Diane.
Emily, on the charts on pages 23 and 24, the pass rates, is that the combined rate or just a straight pass rate?
Pass rate.
Straight pass rate.
Okay,
Pass rate.
I just wanted, thank you.
So if I could just amplify Ms. Holton's suggestion about the SOA. For the last 2 years, we have been hitting the SOQ conversation very heavily. But I do think it's important for us to continue to share with the governor, the General Assembly, and the public the fact that this work is ongoing. It's not something that we do one time and we put it aside and move on to the next thing. This is iterative, and the activities build on one another. So as you write that section, Emily, I think trying to articulate that would be very important.
If I may follow up, I'm sorry.
course, yeah.
Thank you for, and that I do think there have been some news stories that may or may not give the full picture, and that, I think part of the story is our SOA changes are working as intended, to put the focus, the most intense state-involved focus on the schools and divisions that most need our collaborative involvement towards quality improvement, and that we're holding others accountable for doing their own quality improvement work. But, just that, I think the big picture is coming out. Yeah, I mean, I know we deliberately, I hope I'm right, that we deliberately aimed to have not too many schools in the failing category, both because we don't think most of our schools are failing and because we can't effectively intervene with most of our schools. So we aimed to get the number in the accredited with conditions into a manageable size. And I think we succeeded in that. I think I'm right. Or at least I'd like to know that. And then we are, and maybe even some about what we're doing in the quality improvement category. What are we doing with these schools that are accredited with conditions to help intervene to bring them up? Just the whole continuous quality improvement approach and targeted resources targeted to support that approach. I think it would be great to have that come through sharply. And I will say, it may be that it already comes through sharply and I'm still reading.
We can make it punchier.
Anybody else?
On the suspension and expulsion data, I just wondered about, clearly it indicates this has been pretty stable. And I think as I read the report, what did come out is sort of the efforts that were being made to address some of what we see here. And then this area, just sort of nothing's changed. And where is our statement of concern about what this looks like?
So I will just comment back. The board hasn't focused as much on this topic as obviously we have on SOQs and SOAs and things like that. That doesn't mean that the department hasn't focused on it. I do have phone a friend here if I need to, who can talk to you more about some of the supports that we are providing to local divisions. And we can certainly add that information in here. But I also didn't want to give the impression that that's something other than the board in January of this past year did approve a revised model code of conduct. So that is something that the board did, but otherwise there hasn't been a lot of board action on this topic specifically. But there's certainly been lots of department action that we have been providing to local school divisions.
And General Assembly action.
Yeah.
There were law changes to the length of suspensions, but it didn't necessarily address whether a student would be suspended, except in the earliest grades.
Dr. Paxton.
I might be mistaken during this conversation last year, and maybe this is not the platform for it, but I thought that we had some discussion about early on in the executive summary or somewhere identifying not only what we're focused on, but what we've accomplished, kind of like the wins. I thought we had talked about that last year, that this could be a platform for that kind of consolidated look on here's our top 3 or 4 or 5 things that we feel like really moved forward. Am I mistaken? It might have been a different board, a different annual report.
I don't specifically, I know we wanted to have a kind of a top list of data points that help tell the story.
Yeah.
I don't remember kind of the wins piece specifically.
Yeah.
But obviously the board's SOQ revisions, once you all make that will certainly be, several points within the executive summary that kind of talks about the wins there.
Maybe it was the data. I just remember there was something up front that we really wanted to make sure that we highlighted. Maybe it was the data points.
Yeah, and that will be added to it as well.
And Dr. Paxton, I think what I remember, I don't remember the exact language, but I think you wanted Emily to highlight a few of the main points in the executive summary. And maybe not having the executive summary, once that's done, I think maybe you'll have kind of the big highlights.
Okay, anybody else? All right, I guess we'll get the list from Diane.
Yes.
We'll move on.
It's little.
It's okay. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
I guess we are adjourned from the work session. Anybody want a break, or do you want to move on to SOQs? To address the committee with regard to the standards of quality.
No one signed up.
That's okay, just checking.
Yeah.
Yeah, seeing nobody, we will close public comment and move on to the overview of draft standards of quality of proposals. Zach Robbins and Emily Webb.
Good afternoon.
Looks like she left you.
We have a summary slide of the SOQ proposals that we're posting to the screen. Here we go. Most of these proposals have seen little change over the last few months. Just to review, in September, staff introduced changes to establish the equity fund as a means to provide additional resources to our highest poverty school divisions. And we also added K-3 class size reduction to our proposals, as currently school division participation in class size reduction is optional. That proposal now includes flexibility for school divisions to provide pay adjustments for experienced high quality teachers in lieu of smaller class sizes. So based on your discussion in September, we've made adjustments to the equity fund proposal. In your packet, you'll see revised language to require school divisions to assign experienced, effective teachers equitably across all schools. Previously, the language prohibited grouping either ineffective or effective teachers in any school or groups of schools. We've also revised language on the grouping of effective teachers, leaving the prohibition on grouping ineffective teachers in place. We also released a division by division explanation of how the equity fund would be distributed across school divisions. This table shows the proposed equity fund amounts on a per division basis, as well as how the impact of the existing current at-risk add-on fund and prevention, intervention, and remediation funds compare to the equity fund amount. And it also reflects whether a division would experience a gain or a loss of flexible funds under the new program. We also provided clarification that the permitted uses of the funds can be used in any combination. And just to review what the permitted use of the funds includes, that's additional instructional or specialized student support staff, so social workers, school psychologists, school nurses, targeted compensation adjustments for experienced teachers to teach in high poverty schools, and up to 70% of the funds can be used for at-risk or remediation program purposes, similar to the current purposes that are allowed under those programs. We also added language to provide that the board's corrective action plan process shall provide oversight if any school or division with a corrective action plan wishes to use the equity fund under that 70% cap for those flexible purposes, consistent with the current provisions that allow the board to withhold at-risk add-on funds if divisions are not implementing the corrective action plans with fidelity. And lastly, the only other change that we had was to the teacher, leader, and mentor program proposal. We expanded that to provide mentors to include mentors for your third-year teachers. The proposal previously only had first and second-year teachers. And we noted that the fiscal impact that we're reporting only includes first and second year. We're unable to calculate the cost to include third-year teachers because we don't have that data as of yet. So again, here's a summary of the draft proposals that we've worked on together over the last several months. I don't know why I had years written here in my notes, but
Almost a
it
year.
was almost a year. And with that, would be happy to entertain any questions.
Are there any questions from the board? Yeah, Ms. Holton.
Continuing great work. You guys are, it feels like years. You've done years worth of work in months. I had a brief conversation with the president about this, but the estimate of the recession era savings and flexibility strategies, is some of that 371 million offset by the specialized positions that are being pulled out of that? And I'm looking now for where the specialized positions are.
It's over on the left side.
Yes,
It's
several on
about
the left,
100
it's about
million.
100 million.
Yeah, so should that 100 million be come out from under the three? So is it really 271 million?
I believe that is the case. Yes.
So in other words, the estimate 371 ought to be reduced by
I'm
some
sure that's
portion
the
of
case.
I
the-
think that is the case. I'll follow up with our budget office and
And it's why we left them separate so that it could be considered separate. But yes.
But you might, I see why you would put them separate, but you might put an asterisk.
Yeah, agreed.
If it's as big as 100 million, you might put an asterisk on the recession area savings and flexibility strategies to say, if this is specialized student support personnel recommendation is implemented, then the cost, the incremental cost of this would be less.
Agreed.
Yep. Then second, the division, if I may,
Please, yeah.
the distribution by division, I actually have three. I'll just,
It's okay.
thank you. Is that been made, you said that's been done and
It's
shared
made
with the
public.
divisions?
public, yes.
And
So it's
is there a
in
way we can access that?
it is in your draft board book.
Excellent.
Or not draft board book, your electronic board book.
Okay.
And it's also for those in the public, it is posted on the SOQ committee webpage under meeting materials. You don't have a printed copy because Zach can hold it up. It's really tiny font. So we thought if you can view it on your computer and make it bigger, it might be easier to see. But
Thank
if you want a hard copy, we can give that to you.
No. And then my third is, in response to that or otherwise, have we ever gotten any public comment from VACO or VML on any of this because the potential impact on the local shares, or have we not heard from them one way or the other?
Sure. They, VACO and VML, as well as First Cities, participated in all of the focus group meetings that we had back in May. Additionally, Zach and I went and presented to the Education Steering Committee at VACO. We haven't received, I don't believe, any specific public comment from them. We have worked with them and reached out to them extensively. Trying to remember, I don't remember a specific letter. I'll look through just to confirm, but we have been working with their staff a lot over the last couple of months to make sure they were engaged and aware of what the board was proposing.
But we did hear from First Cities
Yes.
last month. Yeah.
And First Cities is supportive.
Yes.
Right.
And
We
and
haven't heard opposition from VACO or
We have
VML.
not.
We have not.
Silence silence is what we think we've heard. They've been well informed and have not spoken as a organization
I
that
mean,
we're aware of.
they have certainly, expressed that there is a local cost to it, but they have not been raising any red flags up to this point about the local cost. I think partially because of the flexibility that we've put in on a lot of these proposals.
And so many of them are already spending that local money anyway, right?
Correct.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, anybody else?
Alrighty.
It's not bad after 2 years to get it down to 3 questions, is it? Okay. Just so there are no real surprises tomorrow, I guess. I mean, is everybody, I don't want to take this silence to mean, consent, but are we relatively okay with where we're headed tomorrow? Because this would be a good place to do it when we can still fix it, as opposed to jumping the poor president tomorrow and saying, oh, gee, I've got this major concern now. Okay, well, that's great. Well, thank you guys very much.
Thank you.
We'll see where, it is great work. We'll see where we go tomorrow, then we'll have great work. All right, the final item for this committee is a very quick, I guess, discussion on the procedure for SOQ revisions. we have engaged, I guess, our high-priced lawyer in this process. And, I think it's fair to say a summary of the advice that comes back is there's a statute 22.1-1801 that sets forth a process. There is, I guess, some debate in the overall community with regard to whether that imposes an impermissible restriction on us. But basically, the AG's office says if we follow the statute, it will have the impact of prescribing SOQs. I don't want to misstate it, but I'm happy you're sitting here.
I guess I said it the reverse way, which was simply that that in order to prescribe the SOQs,
We have to
you
follow the
must follow
statute.
the statute. Yes.
And if we follow the statute, they will be considered prescribed. And the statute basically says we need to transmit, in Susan's view, a proposed bill to the assembly. One of the things we did early on, which I'm appreciative of from staff, is to really show how the SOQs would be as if they were amending the current SOQ statutes. And so that work ought to pretty well be done. Second condition is that we need to provide a budget estimate. That budget estimate, I understand, is forthcoming. I mean, this is, the budget estimate package will be forthcoming from the department staff. And so if we decide to go that way tomorrow, the documents are in place to make that happen. The alternative, of course, to doing the prescribed is to do what we have done for a fair number of years, which is just to make recommendations. And, I don't know how many of you read the letter from Rachel Dean, I guess it was, suggesting that previous enactments of that the recommendation process was in effect the same as promulgating. I think that, again, not speaking for Susan, since you're here, I can, if I get it wrong, just tell me, that the previous times where we have recommended, as opposed to following the statute to promulgate, do not have the same force of law as doing the actual prescribing of SOQs. I think that's a fair statement from your work. And I'm not sure what difference it makes, but, I do think that this time around, and I've made this pretty clear, it's my desire that we actually prescribe as opposed to recommend. But if there's a significant contrary thought on this board, now also would be a good time to do it instead of tomorrow, if that's okay. I mean, obviously you can still do it tomorrow, but it would be appreciated if we flesh this out today and have a good understanding where we are.
Mr. President, I would ask one question. Has my memo been distributed beyond to you?
I don't know. I know Ms. Holton has it. Emily? Maybe not. Do you have hard copy here?
I have a few hard copies, but I also found out that Zach didn't have it, and I had assumed that he would.
Well, I don't know. I don't know why Zach didn't have that. One sits on you. The board sits on me. Zach sits on you.
I mean, I have a few copies to.
Yeah, we can. And I'll tell you what, Emily. Where is Emily? Oh, okay. Do you mind just emailing it to everybody on the board?
Okay, there you go. Oh, you have. Oh, you don't.
You don't
Well, I mean,
have
I
it.
just sent it to.
Well,
the
Oh, is that
president.
right? Oh, I'm sorry. I thought everything got sent to Emily. It's my mistake then. I thought it all went to you.
No, it just went to you.
Apologize for that.
And
then.
Mr. President, just,
I'll do it right now.
Mr.
Thanks.
President, just
Yes, ma'am.
before we distribute it, is there any consideration that it ought to be in closed session rather than open session? I don't have an opinion on that, but you've thought that through, and our council have thought
That
that
would
through.
obviously be up to you. There wasn't anything in there that
Really?
talked about litigation or anything like that.
Okay, just flag withdraw.
Oh, no, I mean, we are entitled, well, I guess on the documentary, we're entitled to have legal advice.
Oh,
for
absolutely, yes.
litigation, so we could keep it, I
And
think.
it is marked confidential attorney-client privilege, so you
It
would need
is.
to.
So if we.
Oh, and
It's not a
Diane,
public document.
you've got it
withdrawing that
also.
privilege.
Yeah, Diane has it also. I'm sorry, I thought Emily had this. The board can discuss it, but in my view, the more public this process is, the better off we are. And I don't think there's anything in there that I would consider to be, other than here are the statutes, go follow them.
Right.
I mean, in essence, is what it said. I mean, had the conclusion been different, I think there might be some
I
discussion.
agree. Or if there'd been any discussion of potential litigation,
Yeah.
which there is not.
There's no threatened or pending, it's not, so. in any event, all the board members will have it, but I
Great.
think the fair summary is what I just said it is. Go follow the statute and we'll be fine. So
And-
again, from the, board perspective, board members' perspective, is there any controversy about going ahead and prescribing? And I will say, we have been in, and I thank actually Ms. Holton for this because she always insists that I talk to the executive branch. We've been in fairly close touch with the executive branch on this through the secretary. James has been. I've talked with the deputy secretary a number of times. I think if there were a lot of any angst at all about us doing this, we would have heard by now from somebody. But I don't think there is. And James, you can speak to that. I mean, you're closer to that piece of the puzzle than I am.
No, I think that I think the main question that I've gotten is what does prescribing look like?
Yeah.
And now that I have that memo, I'll share that with them as well, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Of course.
So,
If I could add just for a second. Not
of
to-
course, yeah.
just-
No,
just,
please. I want it to be
um,
full, fair, and complete here.
I do think even though this is not specifically addressed in the memo, in emails back and forth, we had talked about the two ways that a bill could be drafted. So
Yep.
there's that issue. Also, back in the day, the board really adopted a resolution to do this. So, I mean, that's probably something you want to do.
We will do it tomorrow. If you would give us an appropriate form, that's why we're doing this now, to adopt a resolution and make this happen. Okay, anybody? Okay, good. Ms. Atkinson.
This is not against,
No, it's
it's
okay.
actually for. I mean, I think we have, as a board, done a very studied approach to these issues here before us. It's the centerpiece of our comprehensive plan. I think that in light of the fact that we've made recommendations in our annual report that have not been addressed, I think it really is time for us to step up to the plate and meet that statutory obligation in 22.1-18.01.
And if I may, just to kind of dovetail on that, and I mentioned this in an email to the president, I think that because the players at the General Assembly have changed so much in the last decade or so since this was last done, it would probably be a good idea for at least the chairman, whoever they may be, of the education committees to have a letter from the president explaining that this is a constitutional responsibility of the Board of Education, that you are fulfilling that constitutional responsibility, and what they are permitted under the Constitution to do is to revise. Because I really don't know that there are players down there that know that, or even frankly legislative staff, because most of them are long
That's a fair
retired
point.
now.
Yep. Okay, tomorrow we can talk a little bit more about this, but if that's it for today, we are going to thank you very much for your work on this. Send James the bill, and we will conclude the Committee on the Standards of Quality. And I will turn it over to
And I'm going to give us a 5-minute break,
God, they're always so soft at the SOA.
or actually 7. Let's come back at, by that clock, 10 of. So 7 minutes.
Right.
this meeting. Welcome board members and guests to the October 16th meeting of the Board of Education's Committee on School and Division Accountability. Ms. Adkins and Dr. Duran are not able to join us today for this meeting. Today we have 2 items on our agenda. You all have in front of you and posted online the draft minutes from our last meeting of April 23rd, 2019. Is there a motion to approve the minutes as drafted? Do we have any discussion? All in favor of the motion? Aye. Any opposed? Any abstain? And, okay, we have 2 abstentions. Do we have anybody signed up for public comment today? Anybody who wants to give public comments? Come on forward.
I do have written copies if you all need.
We lost Emily, so
Tell you what, how about I just,
that works.
I think I have enough for everyone. I just handed them out myself, sorry.
If you're good, I'm good.
I think they're. All right, good afternoon. Madam Chair, President Gecker, members of the board, and Dr. Lane. My name is Michael Malloy. I am Director of Government Relations for the Fairfax County Public Schools. Thank you so much for providing the time to address you real briefly today. Tomorrow on your agenda, you're going to see 3 appeals for our schools on their performance level designations. Our superintendent and the principal of one of those schools is actually going to join you here tomorrow. They're going to make a far more eloquent case for those appeals than I ever could. I think Dr. Lane, one of the schools that's under appeal is one that you've recently visited in Fairfax County. So they'll be here to talk to you a little bit. What I wanted to take this moment to address you on today is to really talk to you about why we believe that the situations that we're bringing to you in these appeals really are exactly what your appeals process was designed to do. I cheated a little. I read ahead in your agenda. So in a few minutes, you're going to hear a presentation from Dr. Pivarena regarding your process for accreditation appeals. In it, and spoiler alert, I'm tell you what one of her slides says. She's going to tell you that local school boards may appeal the performance designation for a specific school quality indicator for any school based on, and I'll quote, limited circumstances that warrant special consideration in designating performance levels. In Fairfax, we believe that the current performance level designations for the 3 schools that we're appealing are most certainly affected by limited circumstances as your appeals process envisions, and they definitely warrant your special consideration. These 3 schools really represent kind of unique scenarios with student population characteristics and needs which really were not likely envisioned when your current accreditation measures were developed. In one case, the appeal stems from the unanticipated and unintended consequence of a new state law allowing for military student transfers. The other 2 cases are similar, and they kind of highlight a gap in how the state accreditation system handles non-academic indicators like dropout rates in the case of students with limited or interrupted formal education, so-called SLIFE students that have limited English language skills. There's already a state process in place for incorporating academic performance of English learners into accountability calculations. I believe you refer to it as the 11 semester rule. We believe there should be a parallel kind of, for lack of a better term, 4 semester rule for incorporating these kinds of non-academic indicators like dropout rates for measures of student performance. That's a longer conversation for a different day. I just wanted to point it out. Tomorrow, your focus is going to be on the possible short-term relief that the appeals that we've given to you would provide. We hope you look upon them favorably. Thanks so much for your time, and we, as always, look forward to working with you on these and other issues.
Our first item on the, I'm sorry, before I go, is there anybody else who wants to provide public comment? Okay, moving on. Our first item on the agenda is the overview of the state accreditation and appeals process. Dr. Jennifer Pivarena, Director of Research, will be presenting this item. Tomorrow at our business meeting, we will be addressing on first review appeals from Fairfax and Bristol of their accreditation rating. The item tomorrow is item K. Since this is the first time the board will be addressing appeals under our new accreditation system, we felt a review of that system would be helpful for the board. It will also help put into context the written report item R, Accreditation and Accountability Reform in Virginia, summary of 2019-2020 accreditation results. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairwoman Atkinson, Superintendent Lane, members of the committee. In preparation for your review tomorrow of 4 accreditation appeal applications, I'm briefly presenting to you today an overview of the state accreditation system and that's describing the appeals process. I do want to take just a moment to introduce a new employee, if I may, because I'm excited. This is behind me here, hiding. She's hiding. This is Dr. Julie Malik. She's the new Director of Accountability at the department. This is a new position for us and one that we are very excited about. So in our past conversations about state and federal accountability, you've typically seen a combination of myself or Shelley or Dr. Lynn Sodat. But Dr. Malik will be the new face of those discussions, and so we welcome her to the department. So during the years leading up to November 2017, the board debated and crafted significant revisions to the standards of accreditation. Those revisions went into effect last year for the 2018-19 school year and beyond. The majority of the revisions focused on 2 specific areas: defining school quality and expanding accountability, and implementing the profile of a Virginia graduate. For the remainder of my brief presentation, I'm going to focus on the former. So the revised standards of accreditation move Virginia from a static state accreditation system focused on tests and graduation to a continuous improvement model with multiple measures of school quality. The final list of accreditation indicators on this slide represent a number of firsts for Virginia. For the first time, student growth and English learner progress are included in the calculations to determine academic achievement, acknowledging the hard work of students and teachers to demonstrate improvement. The indicators also include a measure of academic achievement gaps, which has begun to drive change in the persistent gaps we see across the state. Chronic absenteeism is also a new indicator, shared with federal accountability that speaks to the importance of regular school attendance. And finally, Virginia's focus on successful post-secondary transitions is captured in the College Career and Civic Readiness Indicator. The state accreditation system assigns performance levels to each of the indicators we previously discussed. Benchmarks for those indicators were based on research and data available at the time, as well as multiple conversations with stakeholders and among board members. The level 1, or green performance level, represents achievement at or above the state benchmark or significant improvement from level 2. Level 2, or yellow, represents achievement slightly below the state benchmark or significant improvement from level 3. And level 3, or red, represents achievement well below the state benchmark or insufficient improvement in a level 2 or level 3 indicator for 4 consecutive years. Performance levels for each indicator then determine the overall school accreditation rating. Schools with level 1 or level 2 indicators are accredited. Schools with any level 3 indicator are accredited with conditions. If schools with level 3 indicators fail to adopt or implement required corrective action plans, they may be assigned an accreditation denied rating. For the 2019-2020 accreditation ratings that we released just 3 weeks ago, 92% of Virginia schools are accredited, 7% are accredited with conditions, and we had no schools that received an accreditation denied rating.
Dr. Pivarena?
Yes.
Because this has been in the media just a touch, do you want to describe waivers really quickly?
Sure. So there are 2 sections in the Code of Virginia that allow schools to receive a waiver from annual accreditation. One of the waivers, the criteria is that if the school is accredited for 3 consecutive years, it receives a waiver from annual accreditation for 3 additional years, 3 subsequent years. The other waiver for schools that have a 95% pass rate or higher in the 4 content areas, so English, math, science, and history. If they have a 95% pass rate for 2 consecutive years, then they receive a waiver from annual accreditation for the 3 following years. So in most cases, when we issue a waiver for a school, it's a school that's well performing. In some cases, though, schools do receive a waiver and then do not have performance that would otherwise get them an accredited status. So for the 1920 school year, we had 61 schools that had a level 3 indicator, which would have technically made them accredited with conditions, but because they were eligible and on a waiver, they were rated as accredited.
Can I make a comment?
It's your meeting.
I know. Okay, so here we go. So I have a problem with that, and I know it's statutory language. I think that was language that was passed when we had our old system. I think that it is no longer appropriate for the current system, because we have a system of continuous improvement. We also have additional indicators so that we have in the public perception, the state is granting waivers for schools that should not necessarily receive them because they have indicators that are at a level that no one would judge is an appropriate level. And so I don't know how we resolve it, but I think it's something that we should think about, maybe pushing to have that particular piece of code amended in light of what we've done with the standards of accreditation.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that again?
Sure.
61 schools are level 3, but they received a waiver because
they were accredited for 3 consecutive years.
61 schools have a level 3 in one of the 6 categories, and therefore, but got a waiver because in potentially the old system, let's say, they were accredited for 3 years in a row. It's unlikely that any of those are the 95%.
No.
Okay, and then one other thing, I think you said 92% were accredited and 7% were accredited with conditions, and the 1%?
So the 1% is actually broken into 2 categories. We have some schools that have a pending status because, as you'll hear tomorrow, they have an alternative accreditation plan. And then we have some schools that are designated as new. And so that makes up the 1%. Okay, so there is a provision in the standards of accreditation that allows school divisions to appeal any performance level designation for any school quality indicator. Consistent with the board's intent of the appeals, the provision states, as bolded on the slide, that appeals will only be granted in very limited circumstances that warrant special consideration. Such circumstances might include, but are certainly not limited to, floods, fires, other natural disasters which might close a school building for an extended period of time or require students to be unexpectedly relocated. That's just an example. It's not a requirement. We would anticipate that such extended disruptions in instruction would impact the performance on the accreditation indicators for the school as a whole. This provision is therefore intended to provide potential relief to schools that find themselves in those extenuating circumstances. So the department releases preliminary data to school divisions on state accreditation results in late July. At the same time, we also distribute the application for an appeal. School divisions have approximately a month to return those applications to the department, and those applications request information on the reason for the appeal and the steps taken to mitigate the circumstance prior to submitting an appeal application. An internal appeals committee reviews each application and relevant data. This year, the 7-member committee represented areas of research and data, accountability, assessment, federal programs, special education, and policy. The appeals committee makes a recommendation to the state superintendent, who then makes a final recommendation to the board. So I alluded to the timeline for this process somewhat in my previous slide, but also wanted to notate it here. We release that preliminary data and distribute appeals in July. It's due back to the department 1 month later. In September, we did release the accreditation results to the public and held our committee meeting to review applications, and then tomorrow you will review each of the appeal applications and the superintendent's recommendation for those 4 appeals that we did receive. I'm happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you for the Ms. Holton.
So I'm still doing my homework for tomorrow, but what are the recommendations on the appeals we're going to be hearing tomorrow? Are there any appeals that the committee is recommending are well-founded? Or am I understanding the process incorrectly?
Right. So in your board item for tomorrow, you'll see the superintendent's recommendation, which is to deny each of the appeals that we received.
And that's based on this committee review that feeds up to the superintendent?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. And these are on for first review. Is there any request for a waiver of first review?
There is.
So, okay. Thank you.
Any other board members? Well, thank you very much. Our next presentation is a discussion of potential solutions to testing concerns related to the 2017 Standards of Accreditation. Shelley Loving-Ryder, Assistant Superintendent of Student Assessment, Accountability, and ESCA Programs, will be presenting this item. Welcome, Shelley.
Good afternoon. Mrs. Atkinson, members of the board, and Dr. Lane. This afternoon, I am here to talk with you about some testing concerns related to the 2017 revisions to the SOA and potential solutions to those concerns. And this is a topic we've talked about several times before, but this afternoon I do come before you with additional information and some feedback from stakeholders. So as a reminder, when you revised the standards of accreditation in 2017, one of your main goals was to address the concerns you'd heard from the public regarding the amount of testing that was occurring with students. And so there were deliberate changes made to address those concerns, and I'm just going to review those now. So first, in the previous standards of accreditation, students who were sitting in a class that had an end-of-course test had to take that test, regardless of whether they needed that test for graduation. In the 2017 revision of the SOA, you did change that language so that students would take an SOL end-of-course test only if they needed that test for verified credit or if it was needed for federal accountability. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. And then the other change you made was that there are fewer verified credits needed for graduation for students who were the first-time ninth graders in 2018-19 and beyond. So just a quick review of the new graduation requirements. These are for students who were first-time ninth graders in 2018-19 and then beyond. Now the standard diploma previously was 6 verified credits, and now it's only 5. Previously, the Advanced Studies diploma was 9 verified credits, and now it is also reduced to 5. So students will have to earn 5 verified credits regardless of diploma type. And then just a review of how a student earns a verified credit. I know we have some new board members, so this would be just a quick review. So, of course, to earn a verified credit in math, reading, science, and history, students must earn a standard credit. In other words, they must pass the class, and then they must achieve one of the following. They pass the SOL end-of-course test, they earn a locally awarded verified credit, which I'll go over in the next slide, or they can earn an acceptable score on a board-approved substitute test. And you all have a very long list of substitute tests, so that is an option that many students use. In addition to those ways of earning a verified credit, school divisions may also choose to administer a local performance assessment to verify a credit in writing. As a reminder, it was your intention originally that this option would also be available for students in the area of history. But we'll talk in the next slide about some appropriations language that negated that particular option. So just as a reminder, in 2018, there was Appropriations Act language, which you see here, that does restrict the option for students to earn a verified credit in history through a performance assessment. Essentially, this language directs you as the board to ensure that students earn a verified credit in history and social science, and that verified credit can only be earned through passing an SOL test, a locally awarded verified credit, or a board-approved substitute test. It makes it clear that a verified credit in history cannot be earned through a performance assessment. So that did negate the flexibility you had provided initially. So as a reminder of a locally awarded verified credit, this is actually a process that you've had in place for quite some time. It's intended to provide flexibility for students who are having difficulty passing the SOL test. Students here, of course, have to pass the course, but they can score on a scale score between 375 and 399, so just below passing on any administration of the SOL test. They do have to take the SOL test twice. And then such students also have to demonstrate through a local appeals process, demonstration that they have learned the content. So again, this is intended to provide flexibility, and it's something that you've had in place for a very long time. It is important to note that there are different rules about the number of locally awarded verified credits students can earn based on their graduation cohort. So the first row is students who were first-time ninth graders prior to 2018-19. These are the students we refer to as falling under the old graduation requirements. Their locally awarded verified credits can only be used for the standard diploma. They are available in all subject areas, and students may earn 3 locally awarded verified credits. The second row deals with students who were first-time ninth graders in 2018-19 and beyond, so the new graduation requirements. Here, students can earn a locally awarded verified credit for both a standard and advanced studies diploma. Again, that option is available in all subject areas, but the cap here is on 1, so students may earn only 1 locally awarded verified credit. As a reminder, when you created this cap, you were providing flexibility for a local performance assessment for both writing and history. And finally, we do have continued availability of credit accommodations for students with disabilities for the standard diploma. The credit accommodations must be addressed in either the IEP or the 504 plan for such students. It's not automatic. And for these students, there is no cap on the number of locally awarded verified credits. And then there's the link there that gives you additional information. So that's just a review of what you've already done to address the concerns that students were having to take too many tests. But there continue to be some concerns based on the revisions to the SOA. One of them is that the way the SOA language is worded, it's having an impact on the test students have to take to earn verified credits and to meet federal testing requirements. And we'll talk more about that in just a moment. And then we're hearing concerns about the pass rates on certain tests because there are few test takers. So this is what the language in the SOA actually is. And I added the red text just to highlight. And this is in the part 3 that deals with student achievement expectations. And this is in the section that actually deals with students' requirement to take end of course test. And you see that the first line is, each student in middle and secondary school shall take all applicable end of course SOL tests following course instruction. And it isn't until much later in this section that there's clarification that students are required to take end of course SOL tests. They're not required to take them anymore after they've earned the verified credits in that subject area, unless the test is needed for federal accountability. I'm going to stop here and talk about the impact here. So when you read this language literally, it states that if a student is sitting in a class that has an SOL test and they have not earned the verified credit in that subject area, they must test. So many school divisions offer earth science before biology. But you will remember that biology is the test that students must take for federal accountability. So the impact of this language is that if students are sitting in an earth science class, they haven't yet earned the verified credit in earth science, they must take that SOL test. The next year, if they're sitting in biology, they must also take the biology test for federal accountability. So that's one of the concerns. The other area of concern is in the area of history. Similar situation. Typically, school divisions offer the world history classes and also world geography before Virginia and U.S. history. So students who are sitting in a world history class must take that SOL test, even though perhaps it may have been the school division's preference that they take Virginia and U.S. history. That's the impact that we're having on the test that students take for verified credit and federal accountability. But the additional impact is on the pass rates for the test where very few students are testing anymore. As you all know, on our school quality profile, we continue to report test-by-test pass rates. We also report that information publicly. And so we now have situations where, in many cases, the only students who are taking Virginia and U.S. history as a test are those who have been unsuccessful in earning a verified credit in one of the world histories or transfer students. So it's a very small number of students taking the test. And as you all saw in the press release that went out with the pass rates, it is impacting the pass rates for schools. So those really are the concerns. And when we have talked about this before, back in April is the last time we talked about it, we discussed the potential of phasing out some of the tests. So the potential of phasing out earth science and chemistry so students would take only biology, and the potential of phasing out both world history test and world geography so the remaining test would be Virginia and U.S. history. At that time, and of course you have that authority because the standards of quality gives you the authority as the board to determine what the state assessment program is. As a reminder, you initially defined the state assessment program in 1996 through a resolution prior to the implementation of the first SOL testing program. So there are some restrictions here by code, but essentially you have the authority to define what the state assessment program is. And this, if you were to phase out the test, this is what it would look like. The shaded cells are those tests that are required for federal accountability. And as a reminder, all three mathematics tests are used for federal accountability. We do have a waiver from the United States Department of Education for students who have passed Algebra 1, for example, in the middle school. They can use geometry to meet their federal accountability requirement. Similarly, students who have passed geometry in the middle school can use Algebra 2 to meet the federal requirement at the high school level. So while a student would take only one of those tests at the high school level, we do have all three to provide the flexibility. And then you can see that for science, biology would remain. So as we have thought about how we address the concerns we've heard about testing, one of the things we have considered is the impact of graduation. So the availability of end-of-course tests to meet the graduation requirements, both for the students who fall under the new graduation requirements and those who fall under the old. And then another concern is the limitation on the number of locally awarded verified credits that can be used. So you asked us the last time to provide you with some data on what this would look like if we were to implement the phase out. The data you will see here is modeling that Jen and her folks prepared. It is based on the 2018 graduation cohort. And it's important to think about this is the 2018 graduation cohort because at that time, these students still had to take the test if they were sitting in the class. So essentially, this is data that looks at students who graduated in 2018, and did they pass these tests at any point in their high school career. So you'll see that the first column gives you the percent passing. The second column provides you with information about the percent that did not test, and there would be some who, for some reason, were not sitting in the Virginia and U.S. history class and did not take the test. Then the percent of failed, and this is all failing students. And then the next two columns break it down by scale score range. The percent failing between 375 and 399 is important because, remember, that's the criteria for the locally awarded verified credit. And then the next column gives you the percent failing from 350 to 374. Then the last column is the total students earning diplomas. So students who didn't pass Virginia and U.S. history got their verified credit in history in some other way. And according to your request, we did provide you with information based on the various reporting groups.
And maybe just one thing I would add is if you think about it under an assumption for a second that you may increase locally awarded verified credit, not suggesting that you will, essentially only 2.6% of students would not qualify for some of the flexible options you have. And that's not even factoring in some of the alternate assessments. With a graduation rate, around 91, 92%, if you went to just this test, and you're going to see more data on this later, we don't necessarily see that it'll have a huge impact as long as there's locally awarded verified credit flexibility. Shelley will talk more about that over the next couple slides.
Okay. I think the other thing to consider is this was during a time period where students were taking an end of course test when they were sitting in a class. So this doesn't account for students who might have passed because they continued to repeat a test because they may have gone on and taken something else, if that makes sense. So the next slide deals with biology, same information. As Dr. Lane noted here, we have a fairly high pass rate for all students. You will note that the pass rate for some of the reporting groups is lower, particularly English learners and students with disabilities. But again, there are a fair number of students who are falling between that 375 and 399 range. I never can figure out how to make the laser pointer work, but if you look at students with disabilities, you'll see that 22% of those fell between the 375 to 399. And the last data slide, this is students who we're looking at Virginia and U.S. history and biology. So this is students who passed both. And then the next column, they failed either or they did not attempt either. So non-passers, so to speak. And then the total students earning a diploma.
So again, if you look back at the previous two slides and assume that 70% of the students that failed or did not attempt would have qualified for a locally awarded verified credit, you'd hover in at about 94%. And again, we don't see any more than a nominal impact on graduation, certainly some impact, but that's under an assumption that you would have locally awarded verified credit flexibility in more than one subject.
Any questions on the data before we move on? Okay. And then I just put this in as a reminder about the cap on the locally awarded verified credits. So you also ask us to get some feedback from stakeholders on the potential phase out. And so we did do that. We talked with superintendents, special ed directors, the committee of practitioners. This is a federally required committee. And here you can see the other groups we talked with. And these are the questions we asked them. So for the most part, this was done in a already existing meeting. And as part of that meeting, we would use a subset of the slides I just shared with you and then ask these 4 questions. And then there would be someone in the committee meeting who was taking notes about the discussion. So this isn't formal survey data. Instead, it is really a discussion with the various stakeholders. We thought in that way we could get a richer discussion about people's the thoughts about opportunities and concerns. So the first question really is, what are the potential opportunities? Second, what are the challenges? If the tests are phased out, what other actions might the board need to take? like the cap on the locally awarded verified credit. And then an open-ended question, any other comments or thoughts? Goodness, I'm sorry. So I'm just going to read you some themes. So in terms of the opportunities, one of the main was opportunity to do something different. That might be more project-based learning, work-based learning, more job shadowing, an opportunity to expand course offerings, to personalize or focus remediation activities, and to align instruction to the profile of a graduate rather than focusing on content. In terms of the challenges that might face school divisions if the tests are phased out, people did acknowledge that there would be reduced opportunities for students to earn verified credits. There were comments made about the impact on English learners and students with disabilities. Specifically, some folks noted that English learners in some divisions perform better on earth science than they do on biology. And because some of these students are coming into the United States, sometimes they have more experience with the content of world history because they're not native to the United States. Comments about the impact of having only one test for verified credit on the teachers and also the students. Some concerns about Virginia and U.S. history typically being taught in the 11th grade, and the fact that the SOL test in reading and writing are also given at that same grade level. And then lastly, the impact on late transfer students. So students who transfer in the 11th grade year, for example, may have already taken biology or U.S. history. Again, that's something that could be addressed as you all look at changes you might make. The requirements for transfer students who transfer in late are included in the SOA. And then the last question we asked was what other actions might be necessary. There was a lot of support for phasing the test out rather than eliminating them immediately. And the thought was there that students who fall into the old graduation requirements would still have access to the test. Raise the cap on the locally awarded verified credit, provide more options for earning a locally awarded verified credit, ensure that students can still complete a career and technical sequence to fulfill the history or science verified credit requirement. That's not something we talked about, but that's flexibility that's there currently. Additional substitute tests, a question about would the substitute tests that exist currently but may match the world history test, for example, would those still be available? And then thoughts about modifying the course taking patterns so that school divisions might offer Virginia and U.S. history in the 10th grade rather than the 11th grade, perhaps offer biology in the 9th grade and earth science following it. And then you have heard this comment before, but a request to develop credit accommodations for English learners. You have credit accommodations available for students with disabilities, but not currently for English learners. And then the last question was just any other comments or thoughts people had. One comment was that the board intended that school divisions could use a performance assessment to verify credits in history until the appropriations language was enacted. What about a compromise being requiring students to take the Virginia and U.S. history test, but allowing other avenues for verifying the history credit? We did have a comment that perhaps we should ask students for their thoughts about phasing out the test. That is not a group we ask. Another school division wanted to let you all know that they are already administering many fewer SOL tests because of the changes you've already made. So I think their intent here was to acknowledge that you've already made changes that really have impacted the amount of testing students are having to do. This was a large school division, and they said they administered many thousands fewer tests than they did previously. And then we had someone recommend that we take a pause to see how the changes that have already been made to the SOA play out before making more changes. And then lastly, I think there's wide support for phasing the test out, there is some concern about having to implement performance assessments for tests that were phased out. And Dr. Lane, I think you've heard some about that as well. So that really is the feedback we received. And then there are other options that you might entertain when you think about addressing some of the testing concerns. Certainly phasing the test out is one option, but I think phasing those tests out would take some time to ensure that students who fall under the old graduation requirements would have time to use those tests to fulfill their graduation requirements. So another option for you is to open up the SOA and to make some changes. Now, you had some discussions earlier today about opening up the SOA, and I think we all understand the benefits and also the risks. But an option of opening it up is that you could address this problematic language. And really, some of the issues that we are having are really related to the way this language is worded. An option might be to modify this language to make it clear that you really are expecting students to take the tests that are required for federal accountability unless they need additional tests for verified credit. So it might be that you are saying in this section that students, if they're not students with significant cognitive disabilities, that perhaps you are requiring them to take the test needed for federal accountability. That would be reading, biology, and the end of course math as appropriate. And then other tests would be available and be administered only if they were needed for verified credit. So this would take into account the issue of having to take the earth science test before biology. Instead, the student would take biology and then could take earth science if they needed it.
In that vein, let's just think about the math.
Okay.
Help me understand that. And I know I should know this, but I don't, or I forgot it, but I need my recollection refreshed. Okay. So if I take a Algebra 1 or geometry in middle school, how does that test data get reported? I'm trying to figure out the potential impact on numbers.
Okay, so federal law requires that we test students annually in math in grades 3 through 8 and once at high school. So in the example you used, let's say that your example student took Algebra 1 in the 7th grade and geometry in the 8th grade. And so for that student, those tests would count for that middle school to meet the federal requirements for those grade levels. That student would then take the Algebra 2 test as a high school student to meet federal accountability. Does that help?
And similarly, if the student, say, took Algebra 1 in 8th grade and geometry in 9th grade, that counts for the federal accountability, then they've earned their verified credit. They don't necessarily have to take Algebra 2.
Right.
I was worried that somehow the Algebra 1 and geometry takers in the middle school, removing them.
No, it would still be that students would have to have a math score every year through grade 8 and once in high school.
That's what I needed to understand.
And just to continue down the path, the United States Department of Education also allowed us to use a substitute test for students who have passed up through the Algebra 2 SOL test in the middle school. So we have a short list of substitute tests that can be used. So by making this change, it would address the concern that students are having to take additional tests to meet federal accountability. It would also provide some flexibility if a school division wanted to decide that they want their students to earn their verified credit in Virginia and U.S. history. So it would provide some flexibility about tests that were used for verified credits. we could also address the current limits on locally awarded verified credits. As it is now, that is problematic, and it is in the SOA. So, opening up the SOA would allow you to adjust those limits. I think the downside is that it is regulatory process, so it would not provide any immediate relief. I think the thought is that you all could certainly consider this and make a decision about whether you wanted to issue a notice of intent for regulatory action and open up the SOA. But when you think about the concerns that have been raised, perhaps the cleanest way to address the issues is to open up the SOA and revise the language that needs to be revised. As you all are well aware, the 2017 revision of the SOA was done fairly quickly, and we're now finding issues that we need to address as we move forward.
And Ms. Atkinson, the only thing I'll add, I know Shelley's getting ready to wrap up, and that is to say, not that we're directly recommending it yet, we're looking for your feedback, but one of the reasons we would recommend opening the SOA versus other pathways that you could go is it takes about 2 years. You really have 2 years. Even if we went with the direct phase out and you did something maybe by resolution, this brings some permanency to it, some clarity to it. And because the all graduation requirement, students won't graduate for at least 2 more years, we have time to go through the full regulatory process. And then some have said to me, well, why don't you ask the General Assembly to direct you to do it? And as a practice, we don't recommend that strategy.
And if I may add, I think one issue with phasing the test out is it doesn't address the cap on the locally awarded verified credits. So you can certainly phase them out, but it doesn't address that issue. So Mrs. Atkinson, that's the end of the presentation. Really, I think right now, if you all could discuss.
I was just saying, you want feedback from us related to this?
We would like feedback from you today. Our current plan is to continue to seek feedback and to bring, assuming that you're interested in this, a NORA to you in the March-April timeframe. But we didn't want to recommend that until we knew that was the strategy you wanted to enact.
So just an observation. So I'm going back when we first did the significant revision to the SOA back in the 90s. After we did that, we really realized the issue that we had for transfer students, the issues that were coming up for our students for whom back in those days it was English as a second language. But
right.
And we had to go back in and make changes because we had not anticipated there were unintended consequences that we had not anticipated. So it's not unusual for us to come up with, realize that we haven't conceptualized every pitfall that might occur. And so, especially from my perspective, in light of the fact that we had the language from in the Appropriation Act that eliminated the performance-based assessment, I know that when we put in the one locally awarded verified credit, we were concerned that a student could go through their entire high school and not necessarily have to have passed a SOL test because of some of the flexibilities that we were providing. So that's why we put the cap there. Because of that particular change, I think it's something that we should probably be looking at once again. And I know, to be honest with you, having heard from the special ed community related to students with advanced studies diplomas, I think that might be another area that we should be looking at locally awarded verified credits for. So I think there is opportunity. We have opportunity to make some changes that, and I think in the long run, we hadn't anticipated to make it a better process. I don't know about other board members.
Just by way of follow-up, I think the notion that we would have some tinkering that needs to happen after this big a change is entirely appropriate. I think we almost contemplated that. And I think that you're right to do it the only thing I would suggest is if we can try to accumulate what are the other tinkerings that we may need to do, and try not to do too many, but try to take the few that really need to be done and maybe gather input from the superintendents, et cetera, and put a package together, and then let's see if we can't shepherd it through expeditiously relative to the potential long window.
And that would actually be my feedback related to the folks saying that we should take a pause. Don't worry, there will be a pause.
Exactly, a built-in pause.
So do you think that's sufficient feedback? Other board members, are you in?
Dr. Mann?
Just one quick question, because this is all rather new and I wanted to make sure I was understanding the flow of the conversation. So it sounds like phasing out these tests would only be advisable or desirable if there's room to lift the cap on the locally verified credits, because that affords maximal opportunity for students to be able to demonstrate their competency in these areas that tests will no longer exist for. Is that
correct?
Okay.
We would not advise the elimination of any test if there was not an increase in the locally verified credit option, so that you could at least do it across those two subject areas. I think the only thing that maybe wasn't said and somewhat unrelated, but this is maybe even just James's opinion. I'm really concerned about the notion that no one will be taking the Virginia and U.S. history assessment, because virtually every student will be able to earn their verified credit through world history or world geography. And that I think that if just maybe this is purely political, I just don't think that's the right strategy for us in our accreditation system.
on that comment, there was a point made about the sequencing of when this is offered as a way to address that, since that's offered in the 11th grade. And I mean, I don't know how difficult those things are to resequence, but I just want to make sure you reference that in your presentation.
Well, it really is up to school divisions. We don't specify that the Virginia and U.S. history is taught in the 11th grade. That is just typically when it is taught. So one thing we've heard from school divisions is that some of them are beginning to move it to a lower grade.
And with the African American History Commission, there may even be some restructuring of standards and reordering that could happen anyways. That process wouldn't wrap up until 22, and then assessments following that. But that process kicks off this month. But I will say that there's a little bit of a challenge in feeling confident that divisions will reorder that. You don't want to do World 1, then U.S., and then World 2. So, then do you move it to 9th grade? Well, you just had civics and it separates it from government. And one of the main reasons that a lot of school divisions put it in 11th primarily is because many students take it as an AP course, and they're more ready, I think, to be successful on a college level course by the time they're in 11th grade.
Dr. Wilson?
My only rumination here that I'll voice is thinking about immediate short-term, long-term action, and the concerns that bring this, or the issues that bring this concern to the fore right now, and how much, whether or not our timing needs to be aligned to how much pain our students will be feeling in school divisions, and knowing that the reopening the SOA, the regulatory process, is a lengthier process, and how we manage through, or help school divisions manage through that time period.
And to follow up on Dr. Lane's comment, I think even if you were to decide to phase the tests out, we're almost on the same timeline, because I don't think you would want to phase the test out while you still have students who fall under the old graduation requirements, because those kids who are getting an advanced studies diploma need 2 verified credits in history and 2 in science. And they also have a student-selected verified credit. So I think to Dr. Lane's point, you really would be looking at almost the same timeline. I think there are a number of school divisions who have changed their course-taking patterns in science so that they are offering biology before earth science. And so we've heard more about that in the last couple of months. So that seems to be probably the biggest sticking point for school divisions, and they seem to be addressing that concern. Dr. Lane, I don't know if you have any more comments about that. Okay.
Dr. Paxton?
I guess I need some clarification that I probably should already have, but so the concern is that based on how the the classes are structured today, particularly like in science, like you pointed out, a student can earn a credit in like an earth science class and therefore meet that requirement and therefore not even take. Let me do the history one.
Okay.
They might take a world history class, earn the credit, and therefore not even take Virginia history. Correct?
The test.
So I guess that's where I need some clarification around the concern of not taking the test, but still taking the course and getting the experience and the knowledge.
I would just say that again, I don't know that it's an impact issue that the student necessarily will feel. They'll take one, and which one they take at the end of their course is up to the board. But I think when we're reporting on how students are doing as a part of our accreditation system, which is why again, history isn't part of how they get accredited, but it's part of how we report. And I think that folks that go to look at how a school is doing with history and social science and only seeing pass rates essentially for world history is just not the advisable path. I think that especially now, putting the most emphasis on Virginia U.S. history, if not government, which we don't test in, or even civics, which we do test in, I just think those are higher priorities for us to know more about what's going on in our schools. Not that the world histories aren't important. And ultimately, the board really had intended for there to be no assessment here, right? That's the Appropriations Act issue. But if we're going to have one, just opinion based, I believe it should be Virginia U.S. history.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other comments? I think we should go forward.
Okay.
Thanks for the feedback.
Thank you very much.
Well, believe it or not, I think we are ready to adjourn. I just want to thank the department staff for the 2 presentations today, and for the board members for your involvement and for your comments and discussion today. And with that, we are adjourned.